delighted to welcome you to this important and timely discussion about dyslexia and mental health. DCIDA is thrilled to have Dr. Roberto Olivardia as our guest speaker tonight. You should know that he generously donated his time and expertise to the International Dyslexia Association Speakers Showcase auction, and DCIDA was fortunate to be the winning bidder. Before we get started, I want to let you know that there will be a question and answer period after the presentation. So please type your questions into the chat and we'll get to as many of those as we can. If you're not a member of IDA or DCIDA, we encourage you to consider joining. Your support will enable us to have events just like this in the future and help us advance the mission of the organization. IDA has done a lot in the last 6 months to expand their services and products, their library. So it's a wonderful investment in our organization. If you are an academic language therapist and you hope to get CEUs for the presentation this evening, please put your name and your email address with the acronym CEU, and we'll be sure to get you your certificate of attendance. Also, please mark your calendar for May 15th. We're going to have another event like this where we'll have speakers talking about the transition from elementary to middle school with respect to dyslexia, reading, and services for students. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Roberto Olivardia. He is a clinical psychologist and lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Lexington, Massachusetts, where he specializes in the treatment of ADHD, executive dysfunction, and issues that students like ours face with learning differences. He also specializes in the treatment of body dysmorphic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and eating disorders in boys and men. He's appeared on TV and magazines and in podcasts and webinars, as well as events like this, large and small. He currently serves on the Professional Advisory Board for Children and Adults with ADHD, or CHAD, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, and the National Association for Males with Eating Disorders. He also sits on the Scientific Advisory Board for Attitude, is a featured expert on Understood, and is an active member of Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts. And if those weren't enough hats for one person to wear, he also has ADHD and is the father of a 14-year-old son with dyslexia and ADHD. Welcome, Dr. Olivardia. We are thrilled to have you.
Great, thank you for having me. And just one note is my son actually is going to be 16 this Friday. So he's now almost 16-year-old, which blows my mind. And thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and talking about a topic that is very near and dear to me. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's see here. Let's see. Do you know how I get the bar? I can't get to the there we go. Okay, there we go. Can you all see that? Mm-hmm. Excellent. So as Laurie had mentioned, that I have a son with ADHD and dyslexia, and when my son was diagnosed at the age of 6, and I had him tested early because I know the heritability, the family history of ADHD, of learning differences in my family, including myself. And so we had him tested. He had pretty significant dyslexia. And honestly, for me, the first thing that came to mind for me was not really him being the best reader, or I mean, clearly we were going to do what we were going to do in terms of remediating his reading. But the foremost concern of mine was his self-esteem and making sure that this bright young boy does not think that he's stupid, does not think he has anything to offer, does not see himself as defective or broken. And that was my primary concern. I work with a lot of kids who are neurodiverse, who have learning differences, and what is the most painful part about it is them seeing themselves as less than. And so I work with a lot of the emotional issues that can come along with unidentified or unremediated, untreated, undiagnosed dyslexia. So first of all, before we even talk about self-esteem, I mean, what do we actually mean when we use that term? And really, when we use the term self-esteem, it is the degree of worthiness that we feel and value that we feel that we bring to the world. It's an acceptance of our strengths, and it's also an awareness of our challenges or weaknesses, but not using or seeing those challenges or weaknesses as diminishing us, but rather just an acceptance of it and then saying, okay, well, here are challenges. What do I now do to work with those challenges? People who have high self-esteem are not people that think they're 100% great or perfect. They're just more accepting of those parts of themselves that might need some improvement or evolution. They have self-respect. They see themselves as sort of unconditional in terms of that worth and value, and often have a value or level of assertiveness. Now, with dyslexia, unfortunately, for a lot of our students and children who have dyslexia, they often suffer a lot of the social emotional impact of that, where a lot of them will feel and have felt stupid, dumb, inferior. You often see poor self-esteem, social isolation. These are kids that are more likely to be bullied, or in some cases, maybe the kids who bully. I remember when I was in the 5th grade, as there was back then, they would just keep kids back if they had learning disabilities or undiagnosed learning disabilities. And I remember this boy who had been kept back 3 times. So he was supposed to be in the 8th grade and he's in the 5th grade. And looking back, he most likely had dyslexia and learning disabilities. And he was it looked like a grown man compared to these 10-year-olds. And he was sort of a bully to a lot of people. But it was pretty evident that he felt incredibly insecure because everyone behind his back would say he was dumb and couldn't read and things like that. And it's really sad because we have to acknowledge that it can manifest in different ways. Feeling very different, but different in a negative way. And we'll talk about how the feeling different, we can reframe that to something more positive. We also see with kids with dyslexia that they will endure a lot of stress and have a lot of somatic complaints, stomach aches, headaches, feeling really fatigued, a lot of anxiety, sometimes in the form of school refusal, depression, which I'll talk about both anxiety and depression later, but also have a learned sense of helplessness. And what we mean by that are if, again, and this is always under the condition of understanding that this is if their dyslexia is not properly educated and it's not identified, they start to learn that no matter what they do, it doesn't matter. If you are, if you're not getting the support and structure and help that you need, these kids know they're putting in 5 times the amount of energy, they're not getting anything back. That starts to generalize pretty quickly to other things in their life where they start to think, well, what's the point of trying on anything? Sometimes these kids will act out these issues with conduct and behavior problems and sometimes unfortunately get labeled as being bad or oppositional when it could be undiagnosed dyslexia, have anger management issues. In a study in 2002, Humphrey and Mullins sampled some students with dyslexia and wanted to gather a lot of data and information about them and found that half of them reported being bullied or teased. Almost a third of them felt stupid or lazy. Almost a third of them felt less intelligent than their peers. Half of them said they would swap places easily with somebody else. And even the ones that had some academic success attributed that success to external factors solely versus internal. So, and I see this a lot with my young patients who will say, well, I was lucky. I just had a good teacher, as opposed to maybe they did have a good teacher, but they weren't valuing that they also brought something to the table, that they're bright, that they worked hard. It all got sort of attributed to external factors. They feel like they have what's called a poor locus of control, that it's really not them that is directing it. Which was opposite for students without dyslexia. Students without dyslexia in the sample tended to attribute their success to internal factors and less to external factors. Glazard in 2010 also did a study and looked at negative influences and found that teachers who were resistant to a dyslexia diagnosis was associated with poorer outcome in terms of self-esteem for students. Now, peers actually, if dyslexic students had a positive peer relationship, that could be very important in terms of negating some of the negative aspects of what might happen to their self-esteem. So positive peer relationships are actually very protective for these kids. It's so, so important that can actually mitigate some of those self-esteem issues that you might see. But these kids also described having a feeling of concealment, feeling like they couldn't fully show who they were and show themselves. Always this sense that if I put myself out there in the spotlight, it'll get discovered how dumb I am, is sort of the narrative a lot of these students had. So self-esteem can start to worsen. And there's a term called the Matthew effect, which is used in economic theory, the idea that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. We see that with kids who are not getting the proper support and structure around their learning disabilities, that they start to read less and less, they start to withdraw. The school system, assumes that soon they'll catch up, but they're not catching up. And so they become, they start to decline in education while their peers are really inclining, and therefore the gap gets bigger and bigger. Humphrey also compared kids who were in a mainstream classroom with dyslexia versus kids who were in a learning disabilities program or a school that specialized with kids with learning disabilities versus students who didn't have learning disabilities. And they found that although both dyslexic groups did score higher on feeling more timidness and shyness, but they found that the dyslexic kids who were in the mainstream class, who were not getting the resources, had the lowest self-esteem. And in fact, there were no differences in self-esteem between the kids without dyslexia and the kids who had dyslexia, but were in specialized schools or programs that were really designed to help them. And this is what's so important, is it is not inherently hazardous to have dyslexia. I'm sorry, it's not inherently hazardous to one's self-esteem to be dyslexic. It's really when they're not getting the right support, the right structure, that produces that effect. So it's not a given that a child with dyslexia should have these issues. In fact, we should see it as a nation, as a culture, that when these kids have that effect, that some part of the system has failed them in some way. The worst damage in a lot of the kids that I see is really this generalization of this low self-esteem to a feeling of constant failure that they feel. And imagine if any of us were going to work every day feeling like no matter what we did, we were failing at it, that we weren't doing well at it. That really can do a number on your sense of self. And a lot of these kids stop dreaming and stop thinking, well, why bother having goals? And their whole spirit for learning can evaporate. They can start to feel ineffective and worthless and really irrelevant, feeling like, well, what value do I have in this society? And feel unlovable. So how do we help these kids? And what do we do to really start to change the tide of that? So I labeled this the COPE model, and sort of looking at 4 tenets that I think are really, really important in working with these kids. Creating a healthy philosophy about emotions, operating a shame-free, judgment-free mindset, promoting self-esteem and self-advocacy, and evidence-based instruction and executive functioning skills. So first, creating a healthy philosophy about emotions. We want to teach and educate our children that we have to feel our emotions in order to cope with them. And it's very common, for students and children with dyslexia, teens with dyslexia, to almost want to avoid sort of all of the feelings that they're feeling around this. And we want to tell them, look, the feeling is important to know what the emotion is in order for us to then figure out how to work with it and how to help you. There's a tremendous amount of energy that's put when we suppress an emotion. And in fact, things like panic attacks, rage, depression, none of those are emotions. Those are actually all results of when we suppress emotion. Rage is not an emotion. Anger is an emotion. But when we suppress our anger or we suppress our sadness, then it can come out as rage. Panic is when we try to suppress our feelings of anxiety, where we feel like we're almost at a loss as to know how to cope with it. So if we try to numb one emotion, we end up numbing them all. It's like those old-fashioned holiday lights where if one bulb burns, they're all going to burn. So we never want to teach, and we want to, in fact, encourage our kids to feel their emotions. And this picture is from the movie Inside Out. If you haven't seen it, wonderful movie, but very much speaks to the value that emotions have for us. Operating a shame-free, judgment-free mindset. Shame, that feeling, is really the feeling of feeling bad about who we are or who we think we are. And that can lead to a lot of numbing and avoidance and withdrawal. And so we don't want to suppress our emotions, which then suppresses ourselves. And the goal really is to help these kids feel and be authentic, and to know that we don't want their learning differences to ever shame them and have them see themselves as less than, because that's really where the negative part of this experience can be for them. We want to promote self-esteem and self-advocacy, the idea that no one is superior nor inferior to you, that we all have value, we all have something to bring to the table. Dyslexia is not about low intelligence, it's not about willpower. And one of the things that I did with my son is, we were familiar with an IEP, or an individualized education plan, which is very important in schools. I think we also have to help our kids develop an IPP, which I first called it an ignorance preparation plan. Then I thought that sounds maybe a little too negative. So I also call it an identity promotion plan. But basically what that entailed is when my son was diagnosed at 6, I explained to him that a lot of people don't understand this. A lot of people do not understand what dyslexia is. And a lot of people will think that it's somebody who's not smart, that who is stupid, but they're incorrect, that they just don't understand it. And so part of our work is, how do we not absorb that, and then B, advocate for ourselves. And these are conversations you can have with young kids, because we want to prepare them, because undoubtedly, and every dyslexic person I know, child or adult, has had an experience where someone was like, you can't read that, or what? Like, and and you don't want that to shame the person. So we did role plays. I said, okay, what if, someone says, what do you mean you can't read that? And I also told him that some people are not going to be nice about it. And I said, and some people, frankly, are just going to be surprised. They're not meaning to be mean. And with my son in particular, he had really super high verbal skills. He was like in the 99th percentile in verbal skills. And I said, a lot of people assume that people who are very verbal are also good readers. And so sometimes you might have people that say, oh, you can't read well, and they're not meaning to bully you. They just don't understand it. And we just have to, know how to deal with those situations. So one of my most proud moments is literally, it was like maybe a month after that conversation, I picked him up from school, and he came running out of school, and he was telling me how in music class they were singing a song, and he was a non-reader in first grade. His dyslexia was quite severe. And he asked a girl if he could just stand next to her and hear her say the words, because he said, I can't read any of these words. And she said, you can't, what do you mean you can't read them? And he said, yeah, I have dyslexia. It's this way that my brain is wired. And he's a big fan of Shark Tank. And as I'll talk about, 3 of the sharks on Shark Tank are dyslexic. And he said, and 3 of the sharks on Shark Tank have dyslexia. And I'm going to be getting help for it. But yeah, it's not something that comes easy to me. And she went, oh, okay. And then they just read the words. And I thought, oh my gosh, like that was like And such that could have been that first shame checkbox right there if he hadn't had some language and some way of dealing with that situation. Even though in that particular situation, this girl was not, setting out to be mean. But when you have somebody looking at you in that way, it's very easy to feel shame around that. Studies show the best way to protect that self-esteem is early identification, and that the label or diagnosis of dyslexia is so important. It's that the diagnosis and that term is not inherently negative for self-esteem. In fact, studies show it's the opposite, that when kids learn that they have this thing called dyslexia, first, they often will feel a level of relief. Now, they might also have feelings around, oh, why do I have to have it? And, oh, this is so frustrating. But it's far better that they know that there's a name for it and that there's something that can be done to help them. And that when we work on the parts that make it really challenging, there are also features of that same brain that can lend themselves to other things that could be strengths for that child. We want to also promote a sense of what is that child's view and philosophy of learning. And I think it starts very early to, we can promote academic success and we can promote trying your best. And at the same time, it's very important to put things in perspective, to say that, and I know from my own experience in school, which I pretty much hated school until prior to college. I would say that college is when I started to become a student. I felt a lot of it was irrelevant. I thought, why are we learning this? And then it kind of freaked me out when I was in high school, because I thought, if I hate all of this, like, what am I going to do in the world? And so I think it's really important to say, yes, there are lots of things that are taught in school that you can continue to do. And then there are a lot of things that school at this point in your life might not really cover that could still be strengths that you could still discover about yourself. And promoting the idea that everybody learns differently, that whether you're the CEO of some multi-million-dollar company, whether you're an actor, whether you're a plumber, there's an intelligence to all of those occupations. There's a way that I am not a technical person, a handy person at all. So I'm amazed when contractors know to walls to hit down and how to design things. That's just not my thing. Whereas the work that I do just felt like a more natural fit for me. Accepting that by being dyslexic, there are things that we need to do that other people don't have to do. And that can be tough for kids, but to say, yes, there are extra things that we have to do. We do have to sometimes work extra hard, especially if we're working at, bringing somebody up to grade level. My son had summer programming or tutors every single summer until I think his freshman year of high school. And I fully appreciate how hard that was for him, to where his friends are on total summer vacation, and he would have these 5-week chunks of very intensive instruction to just get him to grade level. And we obviously, a lot of parents understandably don't want their kids to feel different. So some parents really can shy away from the use of the word dyslexia, and I understand it, and that we all want our children to feel loved and feel worthy, but understand they are, number one, they are different, but different doesn't have to equal defective, and they feel it. I knew, as someone with ADHD and who had my challenges with reading, I knew in kindergarten, I didn't know what it was. I couldn't explain it the way I could explain it now, but I knew that when other people could just sit down at story time and pick a book and sit and focus and sit still, I was like, there is something very different, because I don't know how these people are doing it. I thought there was something wrong with them, frankly. But then there comes a point where you think, maybe it's me, in that way. So we want to define it for our kids. Accepting mistakes and failure. And I always tell kids, I told my son that, when you have any kind of learning difference, you have to be your own detective and figure out what works, what doesn't work for me. And the value of that is it is a lot of work. And again, things that a lot of other people don't have to do. However, the upside to that is if you do that work early on, as you become an adult, like I know exactly what I need to do to get something done. I know myself so well because I have been my own experimental subject basically for all of these years. So you really do gain this incredible self-awareness as long as you're able to non-judgmentally look at yourself. The goal is to understand how you learn optimally, mindfully and non-judgmentally. So we don't want to be, oh, I'm so stupid, I can't do this. It's that's interesting that I can't do this thing. Like I know for me, I always tell people like I can probably sit for 20 minutes and read. After 20 minutes, my mind is going to fatigue. I need to take a break. So I wouldn't bother making myself sit there for an hour. Take a 2-minute break, I can get back, into it. So it's not, can I do this? It's more, how can I do this? How do we make this work? And putting shame out of it. As I said earlier, early identified dyslexic students score pretty similarly, actually, in terms of self-esteem than non-dyslexic students. Again, showing that having dyslexia is not hazardous to your mental health. It's not having it identified. In fact, early identified students can endorse a high sense of control and confidence. The term dyslexia explains, it validates, it tells them they're not alone, that there is, there a group of people out there. And you can talk to your kids, I mean, obviously when my son was 6, I didn't go into all the intricacies of the neurological data we have, but I did explain like there are these interesting things about the brain that, we know are a little different in dyslexic brains. But guess what? We also find that the brain, I'm a big music person, that the brains of musicians tend to be a little different than people who aren't musicians. And so it's not, we don't want to look at this as an illness. We want to define the term for them before somebody else does. And if we call it something other than dyslexia, it actually can unintentionally induce shame. And this came is an example. I remember working with this 12-year-old boy who had dyslexia. And again, I understand the parents did this out of love and trying to help him, but they never told him he had dyslexia. They said that he, had difficulty reading and he was getting help reading. And when he found out that, yes, he had dyslexia, he said, oh my gosh, this has to be so bad that my parents wouldn't tell me that this is what it is, that it must be really bad. So I suspect this means basically, he didn't use the word prognosis, but my prognosis in life is not going to be good, because if it were this just a word, why wouldn't they have told me that? And the parents felt awful. And I told them, no, look, you did what you did out of love, but understand that that word is not a terrible word. And there are a lot of books, there are YouTube videos. My son was a fan of Shark Tank, and understood.org had a lot of videos, some interview videos actually with Damon Johns, who's one of the entrepreneurs on Shark Tank, him and his mom having these discussions about dyslexia. So helpful. In fact, most kids feel positive when they hear the word, and they feel an ownership of the label. A quote from Glasser, this researcher, said early diagnosis of dyslexia is essential for creating a positive self-image. And then people understand that with that brain, that yes, there are these challenges in reading and spelling and some of these other things. And we also see individuals who can sometimes see the big picture of certain problems and situations. They can be very intuitive, incredibly empathic. I find that a lot of kids who are on the learning differences, ADHD, tend to be very incredibly empathic individuals, have an abstract, nature of things. You see a very high prevalence of dyslexia in entrepreneurs. Now, that doesn't mean everyone with dyslexia is going to be an entrepreneur, but it does show that there are these talents and these strengths that we just need to find. And these are just some popular faces of people with dyslexia. Those are the 3 sharks. Whoopi Goldberg, Steven Spielberg, Jennifer Aniston. This is an MIT professor, Kathy Drennan, who said there's no dyslexia ceiling, it doesn't exist. So we have faces everywhere, and it doesn't mean that, these kids have to assume that they have to be a Hollywood star, but to know that you can succeed in any arena as long as you have that early identification. And then the E of the COAT model is evidence-based instruction. We would never use, a screwdriver when we have a nail. We wouldn't put a key in the wrong way. And this is where that identification and education in terms of helping that child. You know, this is a picture of various birds. We don't expect that all birds don't flap their wings the same way to get from point A to point B. Some birds flap their wings very, very quickly. Some flap them in this sort of circular motion, and they all still arrive to their destination, but we wouldn't replace the wings of one bird with another. So why would we assume that every student needs the same instruction? You know, orchids are beautiful flowers. I mean, who doesn't love, you know, orchids? But in certain environments, they die very, very quickly. Whereas dandelions are pretty sturdy flowers that can, it doesn't really matter as much the environment. They're going to sort of just still grow. And so kids that don't have learning differences might be sort of the dandelion students, where, you know, the environment, you know, certainly can make certain things more optimal or not for them, but it's not, they're still going to grow and thrive and do what they have to do. Our dyslexic kids, they need a supportive environment to really grow. So I'm just going to talk about three conditions and issues that I think are really important and that I see a lot with dyslexic patients of mine, and I want parents to be very aware of. So one are executive function issues and ADHD. Now, a lot of dyslexia and ADHD are highly comorbid, we say, and we know, at least with amongst people with ADHD, about 50 to 60% of them have a learning disability, the most common one being dyslexia. With dyslexia, I've seen statistics anywhere from 30 to 50% of people with dyslexia have ADHD. And what's difficult is that a lot of times, unfortunately, ADHD might be the first diagnosis where it can almost, sometimes parents are told, oh, all of these reading issues are a result of the ADHD. And there's no question that ADHD can impact reading comprehension, working memory. But sometimes if there is dyslexia there, that it's more than just ADHD. And so as a result, I think sometimes parents move away from an ADHD diagnosis completely, when in fact that might be part of the picture. So by ADHD, we're not talking about a deficit in attention, it's more a dysregulation of attention. So kids with ADHD have great attention when it's something they find stimulating or pleasurable. So when I have a parent that says, oh, I don't think my kid has ADHD, he can play video games for 12 hours straight. And I'm like, that's probably more of an indication of ADHD. I never had a problem playing music. I could do that 24 hours straight without sleeping because I love it so much. It's like eating my favorite food. But then, you know, have me sit in history class in high school and I would be asleep in like 2 seconds. Put me in the other class, my attention would be very different. So if we see that, that is more of an indicator of ADHD. Monitoring one's actions, and these are all executive functions. And by executive functions, we're talking about all the cognitive processes that we need to do in our brain to make something happen, to execute a goal. We need to motivate ourselves, organize, plan, prioritize information, ability to manage time, our working memory, regulating our emotions, inhibiting our impulses. All of these things are things that are basically part of ADHD, but it also can be things that you see in students with dyslexia who might have poor executive functions. But I would say if your child has dyslexia, always assess them and have them assessed for ADHD as well, just as I would tell anyone who has ADHD to always assess for a learning difference or learning disability. And hyperactivity, you know, a lot of kids in particular who are not hyperactive might get missed with an ADHD diagnosis. You can just have a more inattentive type of ADHD, but also we conceptualize hyperactivity as not just physical bouncing off the walls hyperactivity. It could also be a mental manifestation of hyperactivity. So these could be kids who stay in their seat, but there's like so much rumination and so much activity basically going on in their minds. So we want to help these kids with executive functioning skills, checklists, having assignment planners, color coding notebooks. You know, I remember in 7th and 8th grade when we had different, it was the first year that we had different classes, different teachers we would switch classes, which I loved because being in the same class all day was a nightmare. And I can actually still remember my red book was, my red notebook was for reading class, my green notebook was for science, my purple notebook was for math, my black notebook was for English, and my brown, which is my least favorite color, was for history, which was my least favorite class. And it was easy to just pull it out. I didn't have to, I could just pull it out from the bag. Breaking down projects into visual concrete steps, developing outlines, organizing desks, lockers, backpacks. Every Sunday night, before my son, would go to school, we would go through the backpack. We would make sure all the papers are where they need to be and nice and organized. And sometimes it could require that every night, depending on the executive functioning skills. And it generalizes to not only academic work, but executive functioning skills are useful in every domain in life. So when you're working on this, even in an academic setting, it can also generalize to other areas of life. You want to help your child set up their environment for success, breaking down tasks into smaller bits, making it very visual. I use this analogy when I pack for trips. I don't know how people just inherently know how to pack. I need not only a list, but I actually draw a stick man and I draw an arrow to different parts of the body of the stick man. And I'm like, oh, hair. What do I need for my hair? Shampoo, conditioner, hairbrush, teeth. And that's how I pack. To this day, that is my pack list, is I have stick man. So my family's like, okay, dad and his stick man. Posting schedules, having timers for tasks. This is an example of what I do. Is if I have to fly and if I have a flight at 6 a.m., I have to then think, okay, what time do I have to be at the airport by? Okay, 4:30. That means what time do I have to have a car pick me up? 4. What time do I have to wake up to be ready to take a shower? 3. What time do I have to go to bed beforehand? I have to go through that because to do that sort of in my head is a very, very difficult thing. So I have to break it down and make it visual. These students often will need and may need extended time on tests or taking tests in separate rooms, recording lectures so that they can hear it back afterwards, maybe have a note taker or have access to class notes from teachers. Sometimes in college settings, maybe have a reduced course load. And also fidgeting and sensory stimuli like music or gum can actually stimulate focus and attention in helping individuals. And when I say music, it may seem paradoxical. Like for some people, music would be very distracting. For some kids with dyslexia, and certainly a lot of kids with ADHD, some music, and it doesn't always have to be light. I wrote my dissertation to Nirvana and Green Day, very high-powered, punk music, which actually helped me ground myself and focus. So part of working with a brain that is a bit out of the box is sometimes even parenting or educating might need to be a bit out of the box. Having realistic to-do lists. Sometimes these kids do work better when somebody else is just in the room. We call it a body double. They don't have to even be helping them necessarily. Just the presence of another body in the room can help them sort of just get more to that task. Sometimes creating a sense of urgency can help them sort of focus better. And for kids that might have a hard time activating and motivating is saying, just do it for 10 minutes. Just commit to doing it for 10 minutes. And usually kids can, and when teens, college students can say, well, I can do something for 10 minutes. And a lot of times when we can start something for 10 minutes, it's easier to keep going with it. And as these individuals get older, it'll be very important to find the right fit for them in terms of careers and relationships, and understanding that when these environments in terms of learning different will generalize to other environments, that they have to make sure that there's a good fit for. My motto was do whatever works, as long as it doesn't hurt you or anyone else, as long as nobody gets hurt. Now, unfortunately, as another condition is depression. And this is something that I see with a lot of individuals with learning differences, and not just kids. I also treat adults who have a history of learning disabilities, whose depression really started and manifested at a very young age because they saw themselves as worthless. So what are signs that our young students and children might be depressed? For children, actually, depression doesn't always come out in sadness. It could be sadness, but it could also come out in angry outbursts, especially out of context. The kind of situations where a parent might say, whoa, like, where is that coming from? That often is more of a cause for concern. When somebody says that they don't have pleasure in anything, even things that they once had pleasure in, you want to be, and not just because they're bored with it, but because they just don't find pleasure in anything. Their affect could be very flat. You don't see a lot of sort of emotional expression, social isolation on a continuous basis. Even when they have opportunities to be social, they are like, no, I'd rather just stay, in the room by myself. Certainly phrases like, I hate myself, I wish I was dead, very, very concerning. Depression can also come out in somatic complaints. Sometimes if you ask kids, are you sad? Or they're like, no, but they might have migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, ulcers. I worked with a 9-year-old who was so stressed out about school and failure. He was basically developing an ulcer. Major sleep or eating changes, losing weight very, very quickly or gaining weight very quickly. Problems with insomnia could be signs of depression. Regressive behavior, things like thumb sucking or tantrums that really are not appropriate for that age group. Angry behavior could be signs of depression. Anxiety and anxiety disorders can be very, very common. Constantly worrying, and not just about school. Like a lot of these kids, again, I find that one of the things that come along with this sort of sensibility in this brain of people with learning differences or neurodiversity is this, you often see sometimes these like children who are like almost like wise beyond their years in some ways, and their empathy and ability of thinking about the world and feel the weight of the world on their shoulders. And so I hear a lot of that worrying. Sometimes it can come in the form of obsessive thoughts, in the form of like OCD, rituals that they might do to try to neutralize those thoughts. Again, somatic complaints, perfectionism, something that you'll often see, with particularly kids who might be under the radar with learning differences, and it's because they're trying 3 times harder and they're perfectionists, but in a way that is not sustainable. Perfectionism is not a sustainable thing. We will burn out. It takes its toll. Avoidance of activities or things like that could be signs of anxiety. I usually say, as a parent, one of the things I would always ask my kids, because, we all know if we ask our kids, how is school today? Most of us are going to hear, good. So I would say, tell me 2 good things about your day and 1 not so good thing. And I would also share 2 good things about my day, 1 not so good thing. And you'll get more specific data. If you think that your child might have some mood or anxiety issues, commenting on what you're observing. I notice that you're not playing with your friends as much as I know you were before. I notice you haven't picked up your guitar, which I know you enjoy doing. I noticed, you seem to be really angry. Share personal examples of when you might have been anxious, or if you felt really depressed or really out of touch with your emotions. Finding physical or creative means of helping them discharge those emotions. And we never want to brush it off as a phase or calling our kids dramatic or simply telling them they'll just feel better. That doesn't help them in the moment. We want them to feel that we're collaborating to help them feel happier. We can teach them relaxation techniques, deep breathing, and self-monitoring, a way of like, where are you in stress on a scale of 1 to 10? And sometimes putting a number to it can help these kids say, I'm at a level 9 right now. What can I do about that? Challenge any negative thinking. I can't succeed. I can't. We want to reframe that. And at the same time, I also don't think we could tell our kids they can do anything either. We want to say, hey, if you work at it and this is something that you're prepared to invest in, then your chances of success are higher. But if my mom told me that I would be, that I could be a great navigator, I'd be like, there's no way, because I have a terrible sense of direction. That is one of my learning issues. I do not thank God for Google Maps, because I've got lost in the most epic ways before MapQuest and Google Maps. We never want to accommodate an unhealthy avoidance. If our children are anxious, we have to actually move them towards the anxiety rather than away from it, and always seek professional help sooner rather than later. So I will stop there, and we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. I'll actually stop sharing my screen here.
Okay. So one question that came in is there a recommended dyslexia test name or diagnosis? And is a recommended treatment plan? The question goes on further about does he need specialized tutoring? And then if he does need that, maybe insurance would be able to cover it. But they're noticing a lot of difficulties in 3rd grade.
Yeah, so a child, from what I was told, I don't do neuropsychological testing, but what I was told from a colleague when I suspected that my son had issues is he said a lot of the tests are to do a real comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation. There are actually multiple tests. It's not just one, because dyslexia can manifest in different ways for different people, in the sense that you can have kids that have real decoding issues and phonemic awareness issues. For other people, it could be some of that, but more reading comprehension or fluency. So there are a host of different tests that are often used to really give a comprehensive view of what the reading challenge is for that child. And I was recommended it, and this was 2011, that when he turned 6, that a lot of the scales are normed for that age to do the most comprehensive. I think that there are certainly tests that can be done prior to 6, but 6 is when a lot of those tests are normed. And it's going to be different for different kids in terms of what the intervention would be. Now, for my son, there was a term of having what's called double deficit dyslexia. So he had trouble with rapid naming and phonemic awareness. So he needed really from the beginning, and there are reading instruction, empirically validated reading instruction, like Orton Gillingham, Wilson method, Linda Mood Bell. There are different instructions, and not one instruction is the best. Studies actually show that they're all target different things depending on your child's specific reading issues. And so my son happened to do Wilson, and that's what I was very fortunate that our public school system actually had a learning disabilities program within it, and he had basically one-on-one, because he was the only student identified as young as he was, doing Wilson, and he did that for years. So that can be integrated. That for some kids has to be part of. He couldn't be in a mainstream English class, for example. Like there was no way he could do that. Now some kids with dyslexia could be, but they might need just some tutoring, like 2 to 3 times a week. It really varies, and that's why having that data as early as you can is so important. As far as insurance from I'm not a total expert on insurance, but it usually does not cover tutoring. That insurance would often cover mental health or any medical sort of benefits, but often wouldn't cover a lot of tutoring. And so there is a whole other discussion, we could certainly get into in terms of the socioeconomic impact. And I've read some data that to remediate dyslexia, if your public school system doesn't have those services, it can be quite expensive. And that's why if your child is part of a public school system, we have to really put it on them to say, my child has a right to and is entitled to an education that suits their needs. And so you need to provide that for them.
Thank you. We are recording this, and we'll have it up on the DCIDA website to let people know that it has been recorded and everything goes well, hopefully, with the recording. So another question that came in, comments on rejection sensitivity dysphoria, where there's an oversensitivity to failure or rejection. It was just mentioned in the Attitude magazine, and it seems to explain a lot related towards this family.
Yeah, so rejection sensitivity dysphoria, it's not a DSM diagnosis, but it's sort of a condition that actually one of my colleagues, William Dodson, who's a very respected, reputable psychiatrist in the ADHD community, has done a lot of work and research in. And this is something that he found, and I similarly found that a lot of people with ADHD, and I would also say that kids with dyslexia tend to have. And what RSD is typically characterized by somebody that often will score very high in empathy and have this emotional sensitivity, and I don't use that term in a pejorative way, in the good way, are very sensitive individuals, really can feel feelings. And at the same time, they're individuals who, if can be very devastated by feeling a sense of criticism and sort of negative evaluation, which, the truth is that kids with ADHD, with dyslexia, are going to get, the messaging will be, that if this doesn't come easy to you, then maybe you're not smart enough, and they might actually be told that and things like that. So it's really important. Again, so much of it is building up the self-esteem and the confidence, around these students, that yes, it's challenging when you have dyslexia. There's no question about it. We want to give them the space to say, this is frustrating. It is not, I would never say it's a gift. And I wouldn't say it's a curse either. But I remember a 10-year-old saying to me that he saw, online, that someone said that dyslexia was a gift. And he said, and in his words, he said, if this is a gift, mine sucks and I want to return it. And I thought, that's interesting. And so I always qualify to people by saying, it has that brain, that dyslexic ADHD brain has strengths that come along with it. However, those strengths won't be realized until we work at making sure that the foundation is solid. And in the case of dyslexia, it's getting the proper identification, getting the proper remediation and intervention and support, and then it can lend itself to those, other things. So the rejection sensitivity, we want to be very aware that these kids do absorb. I mean, even when it's not, it could even be perceived criticism, not just actual criticism. And again, we don't want to tell them you're too sensitive, because that, again, is something that they feel, really sensitive about. I'm a very emotionally sensitive person, and so I'm certainly found a career that works well for that. But I learned at an early age that I didn't want a shield to it, because, what artist and what musician isn't sensitive? So luckily music was like my salvation. But I also remember things just bowling me over, watching certain movies, or, learning about slavery and the Holocaust, like, were just really just overwhelmed me. And I was like, okay, I have to figure out a way to filter this, somehow. And so a lot of it, again, is just propping up that confidence and that self-esteem and giving them the space to talk about that.
Okay. Any special advice on a student who may have been identified later, like around 8th grade? They often are struggling more and coming to process, and also being able to self-advocate.
Yeah, so for a lot of kids actually with dyslexia, you'll often see that many people get diagnosed with dyslexia around 5th, 6th grade, around middle school, or around high school, like 13, 14. And that is either because maybe they were bright enough that they could sort of navigate sort of the system, in a way, and get by, or that the school or whatnot thought, okay, well, maybe they'll catch up. And sometimes parents are told that by by the school systems, and sometimes that, I mean, there are some kids that do just need a little more time. But then it comes, and then I think at around middle school, when the demand switches from you're no longer learning to read, but you're now reading to learn, that's where dyslexia often can get identified. So, even when it's late, it doesn't mean that they can't develop those self-advocacy skills, but in a way, at that age, part of the work is rewriting whatever narrative they have in their head up to that point as to who they are as learners and who they are as people. It's almost rewriting the sense of, oh, wait a minute, if you thought all these years that you weren't smart enough, that you weren't, we want to scrap that, because that's not accurate. It's that you have dyslexia, and not that it's just going to go away like that, but we want to basically start to rewrite and help that child rewrite the narrative and building their identity. And those self-advocacy skills are key because and that's why assertiveness skills are very, very important for this group. I mean, for any kid, frankly, but particularly for kids with learning differences, is and assertiveness in every way, because assertiveness really is basically our expression of our value. Is I am being assertive, I am telling you what I need, how I feel, how I think, because I feel that it has value and that I'm worth it. And so we want to teach our kids, that includes in the academic arena, that if you need to be sitting in the front of the class because you're having a hard time paying attention in the back, you can go to the teacher and you can ask for that. If you need an audio textbook, to help you with the reading of the textbook, then we can ask for that. And it's not only for the students, but for parents too. I've worked with many parents who feel they don't want to be difficult. They don't want to be seen as asking for too much. And I wanted to tell them, no, you're not asking for too much. Your child is entitled to this, to this education. And I think a lot of it is, I always encourage parents to, seek out their local IDA chapters, get support from other parents to say, oh, I didn't know that you can have a note taker like in college. I didn't it's a lot of it is we just don't know. I had my own process as a parent, even being in this field and in this world. It's like I'm a parent first. And so a lot of the best information I got were from other parents who had children with learning disabilities, who helped me navigate the process and sort of told me tips and things like that. And so we want to be there for each other, which is why I'm so grateful for the work that IDA does, because that's really what it's about, is this community that we all are in to help our children.
A possible anxiety that's manifesting as anger, struggling to de-escalate because of working memory and expressive language issues. Any tips on helping with anger and maybe medication as a last resort?
Sure. So with anger, when someone is feeling like an intense either anxiety or anger, we want to assume their cognitions they don't have any access to their thoughts and cognitions. And this is just human evolution. I mean, if you think about it, like if we were in a burning building, we're going to smell smoke and we're either going to run out of that building or we're going to grab a fire extinguisher to put out that fire. We're not going to have any other thought other than those two things. So if someone's like, how are you feeling right now? You're like, what? Like, how are you even asking me that question? Like, I need to get out of here. I need to put out the fire. And when we're feeling anxious, and when these kids, when it gets to that level of panic, it's almost like their body is hijacked them into thinking they're in a burning building. So at that moment, and the case when someone's feeling really angry, that's such an intense energy. The goal is, how do we first just ground that individual down? And so it's telling them to calm down will not work. Never in the history of calming down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down. So some simple techniques, for example, that could be helpful is have your child get 2 ice cubes, put one in each hand, have them put their fists around it and tell them to say, okay, hold these ice cubes until they melt in your hand. Now, what's happening in that moment? Well, one, it's not harming their hands. It's an intense stimuli, but it's very difficult to not pay attention to that ice cube in your hand, which is what we want to do. We want to redirect their focus away from whatever they're anxious and angry about to this intense stimuli. Also, you can tell them, if you're angry, clench your fists even harder to melt that ice cube. So you're engaging them with the emotion, but in a way that's actually grounding them. Learning deep breathing. There's a great technique called progressive muscle relaxation, or PMR. If you go on YouTube, there are lots of guided PMR, which involves like tensing muscle groups and relaxing them, tensing them and relaxing them. Great thing for someone when they're feeling anxious or angry, because they're engaging in the emotion. Versus if you're angry, to just say, okay, let's listen to some Enya and take a deep breath, that's not going to work. You need to engage with it. Maybe have them punch a pillow, engaging in healthy discharge of emotion. I used to play the drums, and that was an amazing way to get out aggression. And I felt a lot of it when I was, younger. And so whether it's like playing an instrument, whether it's, kicking a ball in sort of an athletic arena, but you want to just engage in something that's going to ground them. And then when they're in a calmer place, then we can address the thoughts, like, how did you get to that place? What were you thinking? How do we help you with that? But when they're in that state, it's all about grounding them. And then as far as medication, so there's no medication for dyslexia, but there's absolutely stimulant medication and non-stimulant medication for ADHD, which is very, very helpful and can be very effective. Not everyone with ADHD is on medication or has to be. However, it can be a very effective tool, and it doesn't have to be a last resort. And I feel, a lot of times parents feel like they're failing their kids or sort of taking the easy route. It's no different than if your child's eyesight wasn't very good, that you're giving them glasses. And in fact, a lot of young people I work with, when they go on medication for their ADHD, they think, oh my gosh, why, I wish I had had this earlier, because I can now sit and read for an hour and a half straight, and before I could only do 10 minutes. Or I was so impulsive before, and I actually can like ground myself, more. For mood and anxiety, typically the SSRIs or the antidepressants, which also have anti-anxiety and anti-obsessional properties to them, can also be very helpful. Now, stimulant medication, people don't have to take it every day. Sometimes, because it has a very short half-life, the day you take them, whether they work or not. And some kids take what they call medication holidays on the weekends or vacations. But for a lot of people with ADHD, because it's not just showing up in their academics, it can show up in other areas of life. They might take it every day. An antidepressant you have to take every day. It can take 2 to 3 weeks before you start to see any noticeable changes, but particularly for kids who have depression, who have significant anxiety, could be very, very helpful. And we always say that pills don't teach skills, that a medication is one tool that is supposed to allow them to then be able to do the other work that they need to do to help them. So they're still going to be learning skills. But if it's clear that your child can't take in the intervention, can't take in the skills, can't take in the instruction, that's when a medication could be helpful.
Being respectful of your time, how much time do you think you have for remaining questions?
I could do about 10 more minutes.
Okay, very good. Any thoughts on how to educate siblings about their siblings' dyslexia and the competitive aspect that shows up between siblings, as well as issues of fairness when one has to have services and others don't?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and something that definitely presents itself a lot in terms of, and in different ways. For example, sometimes the student with the learning disability gets more attention. And I could tell you, that I knew all of my son's teachers. I knew everything about that more than I might have known. My daughter does not have dyslexia. I knew who her teachers were, but I was much more attuned because I had to make sure he was getting every single service that I knew he needed to get to succeed. So there was more scrutiny on his educational path, where my daughter's, it didn't require it. It didn't need that. But I also wanted to be sensitive. I didn't want her to think that it meant that I was less attentive to her. And so it was very important to, even though like my son needed help with homework in a certain way, and my daughter didn't, I made sure to still be helping her with things, even though I know she didn't need it in the same way. Because sometimes it's the child that doesn't have the learning difference that can actually feel left out in some ways or excluded. You absolutely will see competition, and it's so important to talk to siblings about understanding what their sibling is experiencing and what they're going through. And let's keep in mind that both dyslexia, ADHD are highly heritable. So if that child, if they're living with their biological parents, the chances are that one of the parents have either of those, conditions, or have a family member that does. And so I think it's really important as well to bring, if you are that parent, and I is like, yep, just like, I have ADHD, and I have a long family history of people with ADHD and learning challenges, learning disabilities, framing that to let them know that, it's everyday people, it's not like this deformity, it's this mysterious thing. And basically explaining to the sibling what you explained to the child who has dyslexia of what that is, and keeping, having them just be aware of it. Now, for example, with a lot of kids with dyslexia, they spell phonetically. And even with a lot of remediation, interestingly, with spelling doesn't often remediate as well. So even as adults with dyslexia might still have problems spelling, but now we have spell check. But sometimes siblings might even unintentionally say something like, laugh at the way that something is spelled, and make it clear, not yell at them like, why are you laughing? But to be like, oh, just remember, like, that's a common part of dyslexia. So, yeah, and then, to almost remind them, because again, we don't want to feel like siblings to feel like they have to be walking on eggshells either, around that. And then with just kids in general, is because everybody learns differently, is to let them know that things aren't always going to be, equal in the sense of what they're each going to get, but it's going to be fair. And I remember as one of these parenting moments, I had my son on the left and my daughter on the right. And my son, his writing, he wasn't writing like on the lines. It was like all like over the lines. And I was the same way. I was dysgraphic as a kid. And I was like, okay, buddy, we want to try to get it, on the line, like, let's try to, and I would work with. Now my daughter was a bit perfectionistic. And so she would like crumple the paper if like one thing was like a little off the line. And so I had this moment where I was like, oh, no, okay, we want to get that on the line to my son, and telling my daughter in the next breath, oh, no, that's okay if it's a little off the line. Like, don't worry, don't crumple it up. And my son, who's very observant, was like, wait a minute, you're telling us two different things. I said, nope, I'm actually doing the same thing. I'm trying to bring you, in a sense, both to the middle. Like, but, and that's what it's going to be sometimes. It'll feel like these different things, but it's letting your children know that you're respecting them as an individual, and understanding that how they learn and process things could be very different than their sibling, just as how you learn and process things could be totally different than your spouse, your partner. And that helps them just have this frame that everybody learns differently.
Do you have a specific outline for an identity promotion plan?
I don't, but I could email sort of just the things that I did. I mean, basically, defining this is dyslexia, is it's a learning difference that people have trouble, with find it challenging to read, to spell, to write. Sometimes other things like their left-right confusion, and which I definitely to this day still have. There are lots of people that have it. And if you are the parent, or if they know someone in the family, if you know someone in the family that has it, and they're okay with you referencing them, and that it's going to make certain things challenging, but we're just going to work at it. It has nothing to do with intelligence, that you're actually quite bright, and that this does not get in the way of people getting to what their goals are, provided that they have to sort of work at it. And then I got I went on Amazon, I got every children's book that had to do with dyslexia. That was like geared towards kids. I don't remember all the titles off the top of my head, but literally if you type children's books about dyslexia, and I just bought them all. And I read all of those books. And I went on YouTube, and if your child is an athlete or interested in athletics, find a famous athlete that has dyslexia. If your child's into science, find a famous scientist that has dyslexia. And so they can just see faces and see models of it. So it's like, oh, someone else is speaking about this. I'm not the only one. That's really important. And then that part that can feel really difficult, but letting them know that most people don't understand what this is, and some people might think that you're stupid, and you don't have to use those words depending on who your child is, but you do want to prepare them that people might say very negative things, and sometimes unintentionally and sometimes intentionally, and you want them to know that they're the ones that don't understand what they're talking, they don't understand what they're talking about. You know, and I remember, I mean, just recently, actually, it's interesting. I was, my son who's 16 now, that I said, the first time I heard the word dyslexia, I remember was an after school special. ABC used to have these after school specials, and you can find this on YouTube. It's called The Riddle of Dyslexia, and River Phoenix and his brother Joaquin Phoenix were in it. Joaquin was like 3 at the time of this movie. And from the movie, which, you know, looking back at it now, wasn't totally bad, but it definitely portrayed dyslexia as like reading words backwards and everything. And that's what people thought it was. And I said, even like, you know, just culturally, what we're understanding is like most, even like people who, you know, are very educated about things, if you ask them what is dyslexia, they'll say, oh, isn't that when you read words backwards? And so letting them know, but also letting them know that there are lots of people that do know a lot about it, and those are the people we're going to follow and listen to.
Okay, it's right about ending time. We do have a lot of questions still in the question answer. A couple of them, are you doing virtual counseling at this time?
I do, yes. And certainly, you know, my email is on the PowerPoint slide, and you can share the email. And for anyone who has questions that I didn't get to, please feel free to email me. I will absolutely respond to, you know, the question. You know, if there are resources, I actually still have the list of books that I bought for my son written somewhere. I can share those, you know, videos and things like that. So please, you know, reach out.
Okay. And oh, yep. Puberty's possible effect on depression and comorbid conditions that may go along with that.
I'm sorry, what was the first thing you
So
said?
puberty, since puberty,
Oh,
they
puberty.
has shown a lot of symptoms of depression. Is that more common for boys and girls? And that does that depend if they also have depression or other comorbid conditions?
Yeah, so puberty, absolutely, you know, I think there's a lot in that. So biologically, absolutely, puberty can, you know, hormonally sort of set off sort of mood, you know, changes and things like that. And for boys and girls, equally, certainly the social demands change a lot in puberty. Sexual identity is starting to be explored more in puberty. The executive demands of school start increasing exponentially in puberty. There's a lot. I mean, oh my gosh, I would never want to revisit. I feel it's a hard age. And, you know, I have a 16 and a 14-year-old now, and they're actually doing a lot better job than I did with it. But it's so important, especially for us as parents, to understand, I think it's so much harder to be an adolescent today than it was when I was growing up in the 80s, that with social media and things like that, which I could do a whole other talk about, I think it's just so important for us to appreciate. And then you put this pandemic on top of it, especially with our group of children that we're talking about, it's really, really hard. And I think it's so important to give them that space to talk about how difficult, you know, that can be, you know, for them.
I will do one last question.
Sure.
This is, what about resistant behaviors?
Yeah, so there's a diagnosis called oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. And my take on that is I've never seen anyone with oppositional defiant disorder where I look at it more as a symptom of an issue that needs to be worked on or treated than a diagnosis in and of itself. Resistant behavior is often either somebody who doesn't have the skills or the tools to sort of work through something or understand something, or might not be getting the proper support around things. And sometimes resistance is also an executive functioning issue. You see this a lot with kids actually with ADHD or dyslexia, that you know, set shifting, which is the ability to sort of transition from one task to another, is an executive function. And sometimes what can look like resistant oppositional behavior is really a kid that has a hard time doing that. I can, remember personally, I grew up in a family where we ate dinner together, which now I fully appreciate and am very grateful for. Growing up, though, if I was in the middle of a homework assignment that took me forever to get into because of my ADHD, and my mom called me, oh, it's dinner time. I'm like, I can't come down I'm not coming down for dinner right now. And it's not that I was meaning to be difficult. It was, if I leave this homework assignment, I'm not going to get back into it. I'm going to lose focus on it. And B, because I'm going to lose focus on it, it's going to be so much work to do it. I'm just not going to do it at that point. And so, but I didn't know how to articulate that, but I would just say, nope, I'm not coming down. I'm doing something. And then it would be, sort of like this, it would escalate. And I understand, I looked oppositional. But when I later explained, I finally got into math, which was not easy for me. And I finally understood the formulas. And if I was pulled away from it, it's all going to just like out of my head. And then it was as if I literally have to go back to square one, and I'm not. I wouldn't. I would just rather not do the homework. And a lot of kids with learning differences, with ADHD, sometimes they don't do their homework, and it can look like, oh, they're not trying hard enough. But my default first is to say, is there something we're missing? Is that the child needs in terms of strategies, support, or skills before we talk about it as a behavior problem? Because a lot of behavior problems, honestly, underlying that are kids that often feel sad, or kids that feel de-skilled, that they just don't feel like they have sort of the skills. And you see that, like I was a class clown in classes that I wasn't falling asleep in. I was the class clown, and sometimes the teachers laughed along, and sometimes I was seen as very disruptive, but my intention was not to be disruptive. It was almost a way of just kind of, self-medicating in some way, and sort of helping like stimulate myself in an environment that I just felt no level of internal stimulation for. So we always want to frame it first as like, what's going on here, rather than labeling it as like, oh, this is a misbehaved kid.
Well, we want to thank you very much. I think Lori Maloney is going to join us in a second and wrap up the evening. But we are very appreciative of all this information and having this, just a chance to really talk about this subject. We know it's quite the need area.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a passion of mine to be talking about these, and again, letting everyone out there know, please email me any questions, and more than happy to answer those questions that we didn't get to tonight.
And just a reminder, we are going to have the recording will be shown, and it'll be on the DCIDA website. And we can also send it out, I believe, to the attendees who were here this evening as well. So it's going to have everyone sign off, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Good night.